Hey, this is Joe. In part one of this video series, we showed you how to change the front brake pads on a CBR600RR. In part two, this video, I'm going to show you how to change the rear pads on the same CBR600RR. So let's get started. We're ready to do the rear caliper now. The rear caliper is a bit different. First of all, what you want to do is get yourself a pry bar and come in. Here's the piston right here. If you look inside, you notice, take the pry bar and pry on the side of the brake pad to push that piston into here, because we're going to put in newer pads, so we're going to need some more space. Notice now there's lots of play in the brake pad. So now we should be able, when we pull the brake pad pin out, we should be able to pop the pads out and be able to insert the new ones in, because they're much thicker. So here is the brake pad pin right here. Let's go ahead and pull this pin right here. At this point, we want to get an 8mm socket, and we want to loosen that pad pin. Okay, we've removed that. Let's go ahead and put it in our drip pan for washing. Now, the way we pull the pads out is you pull the pads out like this. Notice immediately on the back of the pad, the shims on the back of the pads are different for each one. This is the outer shim on the outer pad. It has the cylindrical shim on the back, so we want to take note of that. Then we can pull the inner pad. Notice it has more like a horseshoe shim on the back, so we want to then pull that pad out. So keep track of the types of shims, because they are different. Now let's see about cleaning and reinstalling the new pads. We want to spray and clean the rear pad pin. Get the threads too. And get yourself a clean paper towel and clean that pad pin. Now, if you look at the new pads, you'll notice at one end you have the circle hole where the pad pin goes through, and on the rear side you have a little indentation in a square piece of metal. On the rear of the pad, or rear of the caliper, if you look way inside, I can't put the camera back there, you won't be able to see, but there's a little indentation sticking out, and that's where this pad locks into. So when you insert the pad back, you have to make sure you get that in that little tab, and the best way to do that is stick that back there, stick it in and try to push the pad down. If you can't push the rear of the pad down, you're locked into that little tab. Remove your shims on the back of the old pads and clean it really well. There's a thin piece of material on the inside of that tab or shim. Make sure that gets mounted back on to the new pad. Same thing on the other side. That looks like a horseshoe. Gently take that off. Let's clean this up. That looks like a piece of plastic on there. Make sure that doesn't come off like I just did. Put that back on. Take your new pad and mount it on the other pad. Now, it doesn't say to do this in the manual. I would imagine if you're going to remove this pin right here and completely remove the caliper from its mounting, you could then clean it really well. But for the brake pad change, it doesn't indicate that you're going to remove the whole caliper. So what I would do is get yourself some brake clean. And clean that area really well back in where the pad mounts. Also, if you look really close here, you'll see part of that spring hanging down. When we put the pad back in, we want to make sure that we take something like a screwdriver and push that spring pad up so we can get the new pad underneath that spring tab. Now when you go to put the pad in, I would start with the inside one. That's going to be the harder one to get in. Notice you can slide the caliper in and out. I would push the caliper back and try to slide that pad in. And then notice if it's in properly, you can push up on the pad. It'll push against that top spring. Also notice if I push down, the pad is not going to push down because we have it in that little tab. So now, once that rear pad is in, let's go ahead and mount the front pad. And again, make sure your pad material is facing toward the rotor. And this one's going to be a little tough because we're putting bigger pads in. Sometimes the caliper, especially when putting new thick pads in, the spring up here gets misaligned. So normally you don't have to take the caliper off. But in this case, I have the rear pad in, but I can't get the front pad in because it's too tight. So in this case, I'm going to pull the caliper off, try to reorient that spring at the top, make sure all the pistons are pushed back properly, and then we'll remount the pads and put the caliper in from the top. Let's try that. All that is required is to pull this bolt, which is on the front end of the caliper, and then there's a slide pin right here. We're going to have to jiggle this and pull this slide pin out. Then we completely remove the caliper, and if you notice, the spring up there has popped down. So we're going to have to reposition that spring, or load the pads in when the caliper's off, and then slip it back in and adjust it. So sometimes you have to do that, sometimes it gets really stubborn. We now have the caliper loose, and we pulled the spring out. Now what we're going to do is there's a slide pin right here, and we're going to unbolt this slide pin. Be very gentle. Do not tear up this rubber boot right here around the slide pin. You're going to loosen this and it's going to come out this way. So don't try to pull the rubber boot out of this pin or you will damage it and then you have to replace it. So just take your, it looks like we have a 12 millimeter wrench, and we're going to loosen that slide pin. And then when we loosen that and pull it out, we can then lift up on the caliper and pull that out, reinsert the springing backing plate, get the pads in that way, and then slide the caliper down onto the rotor. Okay, now we have the caliper off. Since we have it off, we might as well go ahead and clean it up with brake clean. Make sure the pistons are pushed in. If you notice in here, these are the little tabs where the brake pad slides into. So we're going to get our toothbrush and we're going to clean all this crud off these little tabs. Okay, let's go ahead and brake clean the caliper. And get our toothbrush. And let's let that dry. Now what I'm going to do is in here, you'll see there's your tab on both sides. We're going to take and spray some brake clean right here. Clean off all the crud off of these little tabs. That way the brake pads will go in hopefully a little easier. And we'll get the backside, which you probably won't be able to see. Let's go ahead and get a paper towel in there and try to clean that out. Looks much better now. Let me show you now that that is off how those tabs go in. Get some light up here. There you go. And there's how the tab goes in right there. So I was having some issues with the rear pads not fitting in the caliper. Just no matter what I tried, I couldn't get them to fit. So I went out and I got my calipers and I did a little measuring. Turns out that my rotor is pretty much standard specification, so it's not worn that much. I did a little Googling and it turns out that these are the Gelfer pads. They're made in Spain. They're rather inexpensive. I went and purchased some EBC pads and I measured them with the caliper. Let me show you what I found. There's the EBC. Let's go, we'll measure this in millimeters. Turns out that these are 10.35 millimeters, and the EBCs are 8.77. So that's basically between two pads about 4 millimeters smaller. I would say that if your rotors are in really good shape, you might want to purchase the EBC pads over the Gelfer pads. According to the research that I did, is the EBC pads are closer to spec or stock specifications, and the Gelfers run a little on the thicker side. So if you have worn rotors, I would say that you'd be okay with the Gelfer pads. But in my particular case, since the bike only has about 14,000 miles on it, you might want to run the EBC. So we'll go ahead and on the rear, I have the Gelfers in the front, and we're going to put the EBCs on the rear. Let's go install those pads and see if that 4 millimeter difference does make a difference with those pads. We have the new EBC brakes. Since we have the caliper apart, we might as well go ahead and put some caliper lube, or caliper grease they call it, onto the various pin assemblies. So the first pin is right here. There's a slider. This pin goes into this rubber boot and then screws in to part of the mounting surface for the caliper. The other bolt we have goes into the back portion of the caliper, and again the caliper slides on this bolt. So let's go ahead and get some grease and let's coat these pins with the caliper grease, and then let's go ahead and slide the sliding pin into the rubber boot, and then let's go ahead, and that is a 12 millimeter bolt right there. So let's go ahead and tighten that in. Make sure you don't cross thread the threads on that sliding pin. Try to hold the caliper as parallel to the rotor as you can. Okay, we have the sliding pin tight. Let's go ahead and put the pads in first, and then we'll put the larger pin in. Then once the pads are in, we can put in the pad pin right here. Let's go ahead and slide that in. And again, you want to look to the rear and make sure the little tab at the rear of the pad goes into the track. The rear pad, or the pad facing the wheel, has the U-shape or horseshoe shape shim, and we want to put that shim on the back of the pad like that. And now we're going to slide the pad in from the rear, and look at that. The correct pads fit properly. Now you want to come and look from the back side with your flashlight and make sure that little square tab fits into the rear portion of the caliper mount. Actually, it's the mount on the bracket that is physically attached to the bike swing arm. And the caliper just sort of rests on that so it can float in and out. So let me go ahead and check from the rear. So when the rear pad is in and the front pad is in, now what we can do is we can take our pad pin, and let's go ahead and put a little bit of grease on that. I like to come in and spread it with my finger so we don't get it all over the place. Now what we can do is I put my fingers in from behind and then push the pad pin through the inserts in on the front of the brake pads, and then you should be able to finger tight. We'll put that in. We got that in finger tight. Let's double check that the tabs at the rear of the pad are still sitting in their tracks, and they are. Let me check the rear one as well. Now we have that. Let's go ahead and take the greased larger pin that screws into the forward portion of the brake caliper mounting bolt, and this is going to take a little bit of fiddling. The caliper has to rotate forward, and we'll see if we can get those pads in and rotate the caliper forward so we can get the screw. And if not, we may have to pull out the pads, put this bolt in first, and then put the pads in. Let me see if I can get that thing rotated without pulling the pads out again. Okay, the secret of that, putting that pin in, is you're going to have to reach in from underneath, lift the pad up into where the tab on the bike frame goes into the tab on the pad, and then that will let you rotate the caliper forward to where you can start that forward screw. Let me now again double check the front pad to make sure it's in the proper slot, and we have to again do this from the back side. And to lift that, I'm going to have to use a screwdriver to push that tab up. By taking a screwdriver and lifting up on the tab portion of the pad, I was able to get the brake pad tab into the caliper bracket, and on both the rear and the front. Now, and I had to loosen this front bolt a little bit to do that, give it enough play. Got those in there. Now we can take and we can tighten that, and we can do that by using, I have a 7/32. That seems to fit just fine, as well as the metric. So let's go ahead and snug that up. And then I have an 8mm open-end wrench. We can now take and tighten down the pad pin in through the caliper. That holds the pads into the caliper. So let's tighten that. And notice the caliper can slide in and out freely on this pin and this pin. So let's go ahead and get our ratchet. Actually, 7/32 or an H6. So we can tighten that. We can take our 12mm open-end wrench, and we can tighten the slide pin, and we can take the 8mm open-end wrench or box-end wrench, and we can tighten that. Now the caliper and the pads are mounted. Let's go ahead and lift the bike wheel up off the ground with a floor jack, and then what we can do is rotate the wheel, and we can double check to make sure that the brake pads can be applied and stop the wheel without any binding whatsoever. If your brake pedal on either the front or the rear calipers feels a little mushy, go ahead and bleed the front and rear brakes. Right here is your bleed port. Get yourself just a plastic tube, or go up to Harbor Freight and get yourself the inexpensive $29 vacuum brake bleeding tool. Open this port, suck some brake fluid through the caliper to get the air bubbles out. Do the same thing with the front brakes. Recheck your brakes. If the sponginess is gone, you've removed the air from your brake lines. And you also want to check your front brakes as well. Jack up the front wheel, spin the wheel, and apply the brakes. Make sure you get good stopping power. And that's all there is to changing the front and rear pads on a 2011 CBR600. Also, make sure that you put the upper spring into the caliper before you insert your pads. I made the mistake of missing that spring, so I ended up having to pull the pads out, put that spring back in, and then reinsert the pads and tighten everything down. So that should, if you make that mistake, by watching this video, my mistake should not transfer to you. Put that spring in first, then put your pads in, and then tighten everything down. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.